Before we begin today's conversation, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
My name is Zan Hao, and I'm the Community Liaison of the Fort Street High School SRC. I'm joined by Daniel, who's the Secretary. Today, we'll be in conversation with Chris Gambian, who's the CEO of the New South Wales Nature Conservation Council.
Chris, would you like to give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself and what you do?
Sure. Well, I probably should just explain what the Nature Conservation Council is, which is the peak environment organisation for New South Wales. So we have about 170 member organisations. So they range from sort of the big statewide conservation groups like the National Parks Association or the Total Environment Centre, Colong Foundation for Wilderness, to more sort of regional groups like the various environment centres around the state, all the way down to sort of local action groups and bushwalking groups and people who are just trying to make change within their own small community. We've been around for 66 years, founded in 1955, which makes us one of the oldest environment organisations in the country and probably on that basis the world. So a long history of trying to fight for nature here in New South Wales. Things like the National Parks and Wildlife Service, the National Parks Act, all came about because of the work that people were able to do collectively through the Nature Conservation Council. So a lot of groups coming together via our council.
So you do some really good work in your community. And I think that's what this whole, Future Leaders Week is about. We're kind of looking at what kind of young leaders can kind of do in the future and kind of people, coming from all different backgrounds, looking towards what kind of careers and what change they can kind of make in the world. So yeah, thank you so much for being here with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. My absolute pleasure.
So I was going to start off with, I was looking through your Twitter and I saw in your bio, you had something, I think it was recently converted Swiftie or something like that. And then I think it was in reference to a tweet from 2020. You tweeted, I watched Miss Americana last night and now I'm at Taylor Swift 13 fan, no regret. So I think
Absolutely.
the most important, and this was a very requested question from some of the people amongst our SRC, is what is your favorite Taylor Swift album and or song?
Yeah, see, I don't know that I could pick one.
Yeah. Do you have a song in particular that's just on repeat?
Well, it sort of changes. It does change a little bit. But I think the one that I've been listening to, you know how, I think the genius of Taylor Swift is that you can listen to her songs and it doesn't matter what she actually intended in the song, you can somehow make it about your life.
Yeah, everyone can relate to it. Yeah.
There's a song called I Forgot That You Existed, which had some particular meaning for me about a year ago, and I pretty solidly stuck to it. But my daughters, I've got two little girls, 7 and 4, and some in lockdown we've been having, after dinner, we have a one-song disco here in my study, and we turn off all the lights and shut the blinds, and we put on a song blaring, and oftentimes Shake It Off, keep it classic. Shake It Off makes it as the disco song of the night.
Shake It Off was one of my sister's favourites back when it was released, and I think it's kind of it.
Don't pin it on your sister, Daniel. It was one of your.
I mean, I love Taylor Swift, but that song I think has maybe been played one too many times, and sometimes it just kind of brings back, it being stuck in my head. So,
it's a good song to think about, though. If you're talking about leadership, sometimes you do just have to kind of. Hate is going to hate, right? Like you just got to shake it off and get on with it.
Yeah, I think she's got, songs with a message for everyone. And I think that's maybe the one thing I would say to everyone listening to this. If you want to learn about leadership, go listen to Taylor Swift. And I'm sure you would endorse that. You'd give yours.
I completely endorse that. That's right.
So now on to some, depending less or more serious questions, depending on how you look at it. In recent years, we've seen this kind of massive appetite for change, I think, amongst the Australian public and kind of particularly, in younger Australians, right? We've seen polling released by the Australian Institute at the end of 2020 that found 83% of Australians want to see coal-fired power stations phased out, and 68% support a target of net zero emissions by 2050, which is a policy that the current Morrison government refuses to commit to. And we've also seen the recent school strike for climate protests, which have drawn hundreds of thousands of Aussies from across the country. But many young people, and I think many people here would probably feel the same way, maybe frustrated by the fact that it kind of sometimes seems like their views and voices aren't being listened to by those in power. So do you think that change is inevitable? And what advice would you give to young people who are kind of looking to amplify their voices and kind of help advocate for change?
Yeah, I definitely think that change is inevitable. And that doesn't mean positive change is inevitable, but change is always going to happen. If you even think about your own lifetime, you're all still quite young, but even within your own lifetime, think about 5 years ago, think about 10 years ago, think about how things were different just within your own lifetime. I look back on mine, and I like to think I'm not that old, but when I was 17, the Berlin Wall had just come down. We still had, the Russian state was still a sort of viable entity in a sort of in a Cold War sense. The Clinton administration had just come to power, and at that point, the big ecological or the big environmental challenge at the time was the hole in the ozone layer, which was a crisis that there was in some ways probably more global action on more quickly than we've seen with climate change. So change is going to happen, like technological change is going to happen, social change is going to happen. Nothing is static, things are going to keep moving. The question is, in whose interest do things change? And what sort of role are we going to play to try to influence what that change is going to be, or shape it and make sure that it ends up being change for the better, change that tends towards justice and fairness and equity for everybody, environmental sustainability, all those things that most of us value. That is not inevitable, but change itself definitely is. And so I think the question you then got to ask yourself is, well, what role am I going to choose to play? I can be a leader, I can be passive, I can be a victim. And if you're not prepared to lead, if you're not prepared, and leadership doesn't mean you have to be the boss. Leadership doesn't mean you have to be the Prime Minister or an activist or anything like that. But practicing leadership within your own life, within your own sort of sphere of influence, I think is absolutely key. And really the choices are you can have change happen to you and you can be a victim, or you can watch it sort of sail by and completely disengage. But I think that's a terrible waste of people's talents, and it means that you're surrendering your future to other decision makers who may not make choices in your interests.
And so it's kind of all about, would you say, just taking the initiative and sometimes looking at it? I guess sometimes it can kind of be easy to look at, situations and say, look, everything will turn out for the best. And, even though that's a good positive mindset, sometimes you've just got to kind of jump in there and have your say. Would you say that like it's really important for people just to kind of get their voice heard is the most important thing?
I'm going to say something potentially a bit controversial and say, actually, the most important thing is not to have your voice heard. The most important thing is to listen and to hear the voices that are not being heard. A lot of us, including, I imagine, a lot of the people listening to this interview, enter society with a lot of opportunity and a lot of privilege, blessed with great intellect, perhaps families that are able to send you to good schools and get you good educations. Just as Australians, we do better than most around the world. I think the most important thing we can do is listen. Because when you listen to understand and you listen with an intent to process the perspectives of other people before you use your voice, before you use the privilege that you've got and the opportunities you've got, then you tend yourself towards working in the interests of everybody. A society that is just about people raising their own voices from their own perspective means that the loudest voices get heard and those dominant interests continue to dominate. But that doesn't mean they're necessarily the right and the only perspectives that need to be heard. So I think one of the questions we should all ask ourselves, and certainly as somebody who is involved in advocating for social change my whole life, one of the most important things I think is to listen to the voices who aren't being heard, and make sure that you have a deep understanding of what the dynamics are, what's going on, so that you can shape the change in the collective interest.
I mean, I really like the way that you put that it's kind of about all working together rather than just trying to kind of make our own way. If everyone kind of builds together this listening and kind of bouncing ideas off each other, that's how we kind of get to change.
Well, I'll give you a simple kind of manifestation of that, and one that a lot of people would care a lot about, which is climate change. And you just mentioned a moment ago coal-fired power stations and things like that. If only the powerful voices succeed, then we don't solve climate change. Because the voices that have the most to lose from climate action happen also to be some of the most powerful voices in our society. So really, going into big social questions, not just from your own self-interest, but with a sense of collective interest, I think is really important.
So Chris, right on the topic of climate change. So the latest IPCC report warned us that human activity is changing the climate in unprecedented ways, and namely this is a code red for humanity. However, it is reported that if immediate large-scale cuts to emissions are made now, the curve will eventually bend to a level considered acceptable under the Paris Agreement. And Prime Minister Scott Morrison has refused to commit to a target of net zero emissions by 2050 and to adopt more ambitious plans to reach our 2030 emissions reduction target. So how do you feel about this, and what do you think the ramifications of our government's climate inaction will be?
Well, I'm very worried. I'm very worried that the effects on Australia will be enormous. We are on the front line of the impacts of climate change. And this is not some theoretical thing for the future. We are already experiencing it. The worst 2 droughts that Australia has ever experienced since European settlement, which is some time now, have been over the last 10 years or last 15 years. Those bushfires that we saw the summer before last, the worst ever recorded. Again, these things are happening and directly affecting people in Australia right now. We're not talking about people from 2050 in 29 years' time. This is happening to us right now. Our agriculture is being affected right now. Our livelihoods are being affected right now. Our economy is being affected right now. So failing to take action is putting us all at grave risk. Now, the fact that the Australian government not only is refusing to set interim targets, realistic interim targets, that is, for 2030, failing to reach a target by 2050 that every state and territory, Labor or Liberal, has already committed to. So Australia will get to zero. I'm very confident that we will get to net zero by 2050. Very, very confident of that. I feel very optimistic about our capacity to make change here in Australia. But it's not going to be because of any of the leadership shown by the Morrison government, and that is a great tragedy because we could be doing it so much better. It could be so much more beneficial to our country to be taking action on climate change if coordinated by our federal government. The states and territories are actually, by and large, doing a fair bit to transition the economy to a clean energy economy, to a low carbon economy. But without coordination from the Australian government, we're missing out on such great opportunities. And the really big threat that we've got to our economy at the moment is if we start to see other countries around the world respond to our inaction through things like carbon tariffs, we've got a very, very big economic problem in the short term. We're not talking about in 20 years' time, we're talking about in 3 years' time or 5 years' time. If we don't transition our economy, we're going to be left behind. If we don't move into clean energy, things like clean steel and products that are made using little or no carbon, then we will miss out on the great opportunities of the future. And that will be a terrible shame, to say nothing of worse bushfires, worse floods, worse droughts, big threats to our food supply, big threats to our national security.
Obviously, we're talking about the future here. So, the young people, our generation, will be the future. So what do you think us young people can do to, push the government to act on these targets and goals and really make changes?
Vote. And it doesn't matter who you decide to vote for, Labor, Liberal, Green, Calathumpian, doesn't matter. Turn up. If you want to be a conservative person and take action on climate, there's heaps of people in the Liberal Party who want to do that. You should join them and get involved. You want to do that in the Labor Party, do that as well. You want to do that in the Greens, do that as well. You want to do it as an independent, do that as well. But get up and get involved, because until we see the sort of groundswell of activism from across the community, this is not a burden that should only sit on the shoulders of 17-year-olds, mind you. This is for all of us. The best thing that we can do is make it clear to the political class that this is action we expect. And if people are not prepared to take action, if you're going to deny the science of climate, if you're going to argue for delay, if you're going to try to muddy the waters of climate action, then you should be feeling some repercussions when it comes to the ballot box. We should be saying the same thing to corporates. If you're not prepared to take serious responsibility as a corporate, we should be demonstrating that you won't have the support of the Australian people. Don't buy the products. Don't bank with the banks that aren't prepared to get out of fossil fuels. Don't support people that aren't prepared to support all of us.
In 2019, when you were first appointed as CEO of the Nature Conservation Council, you said, as a community, we have to make a decision about the legacy we want to leave. Will we destroy everything around us to squeeze out another dollar for the bottom line in the short term? Or do we value our role as custodians of the land, air, and water and their importance to our long-term interests? With the benefit of 100 years of hindsight, how do you think people living in the year 2121 will judge the way that humanity has acted in regards to our planet? Do you think it's still possible for us to take on, as you said, this role of becoming custodians of the planet rather than our current role, which I think many people would say, we're exploiting the planet really? Do you think it's able for us to become custodians once again? Or do you think that's a goal that we're far past?
I absolutely think it's possible. And when you think, that's such a great question, but when you think about 100 years from now, how will we be judged? Well, think about 100 years ago. Think about 1921 instead of 2021. What was going on in the world? Well, the truth is there was a lot of things going on in the world. The world was divided along a bunch of different ideological lines, or a bunch of different ideas. We'd just come out, of the First World War, heading into this sort of big economic boom time of the 20s. Little did they know that they were heading to the Great Depression. So they were living it up at the time. Now, during that period, there was simultaneously forces for greed, forces of war, forces of power struggle, forces of oppression and domination and colonialism, of sexism, of racism. All of those forces existed. But at the same time, there were incredible forces for good. People who were trying to do conservation, people who were fighting racism, people who were fighting to raise the rights and equality of women, people who were fighting back against colonialism and fighting for independence, people who were fighting for economic fairness. Trade unionism was really getting a hold in that same period. So in any era, there are these sort of two competing tensions always. So to mine, the choice that we've got to make is, what are we going to make our own lives about? Are we going to make it about greed? Are we going to make it about sort of pulling out the last buck, if you can pull out a buck? Is it about sort of triumph of the fittest? Is it about sort of the race, the competition between individuals? Or is it about our collective community interests? Is it about looking after things for our next generation, for our kids and our kids' kids and everybody else? Is it about trying to create better cooperation around the world and more international harmony? These are the choices that we as individuals need to make. So I feel great hope that everything that we do can make a really big difference, will actually work, and will just help, bend that arc. Collectively, between us all, the efforts that we all make can actually make a huge difference. And one of the things I've noticed in this job in the last couple of years that I've been in it is just how big a difference a small change can make. Just a small difference, something that is a relatively little change, can make a huge difference to, it has a real multiplier effect in terms of the benefits that can be passed down. So, small changes in things that you're prepared to protect, small measures you're prepared to take through regulation, small efforts you can make in your local community can have a really big compounding effect. So I feel incredibly hopeful that despite the frustrations of this particular moment, we can get through them. When I was a kid, probably a bit younger than you are now, the big existential threat to the world was nuclear war. Talk about annihilation. We were talking about, sort of having 8 minutes warning. You've got 25 years, 30 years warning. We were talking, people were talking about sort of having an 8-minute warning. And that was in the 80s. The world has shifted. Things have changed. Things keep changing. There is always hope. The best thing about that IPCC report the other day is the point that it made quite emphatically, which is there is still hope. And I would say I have more hope today, 2 years into this job, about our ability to fix climate change and to take meaningful action on climate than I did 2 years ago. And I think, that's a positive thing.
And would you say kind of, adding on to that kind of custodianship of land, I know we have a lot of people across the globe looking towards particularly, Indigenous cultures, like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander practices, even here in Australia, which kind of, when you look at it, when you look at the history, which, is often kind of been written by, in the past, I guess, white colonizers, and have kind of, downplayed the role that Indigenous Australians played in kind of maintaining the land. But I think we're kind of seeing more research coming to light, where actually, they did, kind of maintain this careful balance between, the kind of ecosystem and living in harmony with that. Do you think there's kind of any role to be found in looking towards, not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but Indigenous peoples across the world? Do you think there's any benefit in looking towards them for kind of solutions for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, I do. And you need look no further than First Nations people here in Australia and the role that country plays in First Nations culture. The land is so important. The water is so important. Species are so important. And then you think about our interests right now. The land is really important. The water is really important. Species are really important. The difference is well, there is no difference between the human needs of First Nations people and the rest of us. But the philosophy, the approach, the orientation is completely different. We know that living in harmony with the land, not trying to fight it, not trying to have domination over it, but living within it, in connection to it, we know that it will nurture us. But we've got to be prepared to listen. We've got to be prepared to learn from our First Nations brothers and sisters. But most of all, we need to, again, put that collective interest at the forefront of our decision-making, the forefront of our orientations.
So these days, like everywhere you look, negative news is inescapable, right? Whether it be the release of, a UN climate report, warning of irreversible damage to our world, or even just the COVID-19 outbreak, that's coming right now. We're currently in lockdown, obviously, right? So is there something in particular that, you find gives you hope for the future?
I could say something really glib, like young people give me hope, and they do. You do. This event gives me hope. The school strike for climate gives me hope. All of those things give me hope. But I think the thing that gives me hope more than anything is the fundamental decency of people. That in all the years that I've been an organiser, I've been a political candidate, I've been an environmentalist, I've been a trade unionist. The thing that is really kind of breathtaking is the amount that people are prepared to give up their time, give up their money in the community's interest. In some cases, take great risks. Thankfully, less so in Australia, but overseas, in some cases, prepared to risk their lives for the community's interest. That gives me hope. The fact that we can come together and take action together, stand in solidarity with each other, they're the things that give me hope. I think one of the greatest things a person can experience is a group of people who decide to stick by each other. As a trade union official, I got to see that a lot. And as a conservationist now, I get to see communities giving up enormous amounts of time and money to fight for little parcels of nature that they care about. And, that gives me an enormous amount of hope.
Now we've got some kind of questions from people. We had some questions from across the state, and I think a lot of people were kind of interested in your work as a conservationist and working for the Nature Conservation Council. And so we had, all sorts of questions. I guess one of the major ones that kind of popped up, especially, and I think it's important for high school students, right, who are looking towards the kind of immediate future. And it was, what did you study at university? And what advice would you give to, a young person who's looking to, pursue a career in conservation, whatever that be, whether it be on the ground, hands-on work, or, advocacy, or, anything really, yeah.
Well, I have to confess, I've only been a sort of paid conservationist for a couple of years now. So my background is in the trade union movement. So I studied a Bachelor of Economics, Social Sciences at the University of Sydney, so political economy and industrial relations. And then I did a master's degree in labour law. So I often joke with the people I work with that I don't know the names of all the trees and I don't know the names of all the plants and animals, but that doesn't mean I can't fight for them. So I like to think that we are a movement of people who care a lot about nature, and that's sort of where my expertise is, bringing people together, sharing stories, finding common interests, and then fighting for those common interests. So there's a lot of pathways, I guess, is one of the ways I would say it. A lot of people do environmental science degrees, which is definitely a good thing to do. But there's a lot of pathways, and it's probably the simplest is just get involved, volunteer, join a local group, come and do some work experience at the Nature Conservation Council if you want. But there's lots of ways to get involved, work out what you enjoy. Work gets a lot easier if you can do the things that you love. And I've been very fortunate in my career to be able to work on things that just mean a lot to me personally. And so, don't get me wrong, I like holidays and days off are wonderful, and work can be really hard and really exhausting, even when you're doing something you love. But it does make it a lot easier to get out of bed in the morning if you're doing something that you care deeply about.
And so would you say that, I guess, you were talking about how you've kind of had, you had this past background, you didn't necessarily study, a degree at university that would lead to conservation. Would you say that kind of points towards, everyone, no matter what career choice they take, everyone being able to, implement some sort of, conservationist mindset into their kind of career, or just any future, career path or journey that they go on? How can people kind of incorporate that? If someone wants to be, wants to go into law, or if someone wants to, become a GP, or, become like a specialist in any sort of area that's not specifically conservation, how can people, both in their work life, but also just in their daily life, incorporate kind of a conservationist mindset? Yeah,
that's exactly right. There are a lot of pathways, and even if the only thing you do is chip in some money, or get involved in your local group, in your local area, to do some bush regeneration in the local park, or lobby politicians about climate action, or get involved in making sure that a river is being looked after. All of these things are really useful. I think overall, I would say, no matter what career you decide you want to be involved in, and no matter what your sort of big passionate issue is, I'm a conservationist right now, but I've got a lot of issues that I care a lot about. I would say make sure you've got at least one thing that you're involved in that isn't your work. You could be a stockbroker, you could be a real estate agent, you could be a hairdresser, whatever the hell you want to be is fine. Do something that you can get satisfaction out of and is going to earn you a living and all the things that you need to be able to do in your life. But always try to have at least one other thing going on, another group, whether that's your trade union, whether that's your church, whether that's your local environment group, whether that's your local St. Vincent de Paul or Salvos or whatever. Just something else that you can acquire, just something else that you can be a part of, because being able to feel like you're part of a community is probably one of the most satisfying things that you can do. And throughout my adult life, the various ways I've been able to be involved in community, I would say, are some of the most rewarding things I've done. As including, more recently, as my little girl has started school, being involved in the local P&C and getting to know the other parents and the teachers and doing things for the school. Just those little things actually give you a better, more rounded perspective, and it actually makes you a better worker as well. So even if you are a stockbroker, you'll be a better stockbroker if you're also involved in your local bush care group, or you're involved in the local Scouts Association or whatever. Make sure that some sort of community involvement is part of what you decide to do with your life.
And kind of, on this idea of, kind of what can young people do in the kind of near future, I guess something, again, that everyone's looking forward to is, university, or, I'm sure there'll be lots of people who want to, pursue an education in TAFE, or like a vocational sort of education. If you could go back in time to when you graduated, and tell yourself one thing at that point in time, your kind of younger self, and give yourself a piece of advice, or even just a piece of motivation for the future, what would that be?
Wow, that's a big question. I think take more time to get to know people. Listen to people. Be less quick to tell people what you think, and more quick to try to listen to understand somebody else. Because then you in turn will be heard, right? Like, this is not about you being silent. This is about you being in a conversation. But take time to listen. And I think I would tell myself to try to be braver, to expand beyond the things that I'm comfortable with and my comfort zone, and even the people and places that I'm comfortable with, and just try different things. 2 years ago, I went travelling as part of this job up the Darling Barker River. So we started in Mildura and drove up to Wilcannia over the course of a couple of days. And it was a part of the state that I'd never been to before. It's part of the state most people have never been to. And I was a bit nervous, to be honest. I, grown up in Sydney, lived in Sydney my whole life, didn't really know how a Sydney-sider, dark skin would be received, environmentalist would be received in that part of the state. And it stands out as probably one of the best experiences I've ever had in my life. So much so I can't wait for lockdown to be over so I can go back for the third time. I wish I had spent more time trying different things and learning about different people, and being braver about expanding my horizons, because it is so rewarding when you decide to do that. It is so incredibly rewarding to see other people's perspectives and how other people live, because this is a pretty extraordinary community we've got,
So Chris, you've been through a lot of different jobs. You've been, involved as a political candidate. You've been involved with the trades union. So what interests you the most about, your career?
I love solidarity. I love when people decide to do things together and look after each other. I just find it the best feeling and experience in the world when people look each other in the eye and say, we're going to be a group together, and we're going to do this together, and we're going to win together, and if we lose, we're going to lose together. But we're going to do it together, and you don't have to be alone. Because I think we've all experienced times when we felt alone and we felt lonely, even if we're, in a large crowd. But that feeling of being able to be part of something and know that even if a person is a stranger, they're your comrade, they're your brother or your sister, is one of the most uplifting things that I think you can experience in your life. And no matter what I do, I hope that I'm always doing something that helps bring people together and get people to act together on their values.
You talked about how you had to get over some challenges throughout your career, right? And so what are some, of these hurdles, and how did you manage to overcome them?
Well, how long have you got? I realise it now, and I didn't realise it then. But, I was born a year after my parents got here from India. Now, they are Anglo-Indians, so that means they were brought up Catholic. They're only English-speaking. They've got a lot of Western culture, but they were from a completely foreign country. And when they got here in the 70s, this was a very different place to what it is now. And I think growing up, I didn't realise how fresh they were, how new Australian culture was for them. And I always felt that I was a bit of an outsider. My parents joke about when they first arrived here in this area, which I still live in. They were the only brown-skinned people in the area. It's not true anymore, but back then, our family were the only sort of brown-skinned people in the area. It was all very different, and I think when you grow up outside of the kind of mainstream Australian culture, it can be really hard to just learn how it works. It's not necessarily racism. It's just not knowing how things work. I can see it as I raise my kids, things that my parents would have kind of been completely befuddled about how you're supposed to do that, come really naturally to me because I've done it. I grew up here. I know what it's like. So I think that experience of growing up as an outsider always made me feel like a bit of an outsider. I also think that I just don't look like what people had in mind when they think of a sort of mainstream Australian. Again, not necessarily a racism thing. It's just I don't look like the sort of person that they're expecting to see. So when I ran for Parliament for the first time, I got a lot of kind of flack over my campaign posters. And people would point out your hair is too messy. Well, it probably is a bit messy at the moment because of lockdown. Or, you're smiling too much, or you don't have a tie on, and, all of this kind of stuff. And, the truth is they just weren't used to seeing a brown face on a political poster. Maybe they didn't even realise that themselves. They probably didn't. They just weren't used to it. So I feel like that can be a barrier, but it can also be a great strength and a great opportunity because it means that I can connect with people in different types of people, and I can connect with people who are not used to being connected with. And it does mean that our Australian community is just more diverse now, and diversifies when I get involved and do something and am the only brown-skinned person in the room or whatever. So those things can be barriers, but we've all got barriers. Every single person has got something that holds them back. The trick is to not let the thing that holds you back hold you back, and to think about how you can turn that into something that can push you forward. And I do genuinely think that's possible. I don't say that as an argument against acknowledging those barriers, or acknowledging that racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and all the things that we know exist in our society exist, because they do exist and they shouldn't, and we should fight against them. But if you're feeling one of those barriers, you get to choose how you respond to the barrier. And I would say, take a chance. Know that other people will have your back. That there's a lot of us who will make sure that somebody's there supporting you.
Now, Chris, when kind of looking at like conservation in kind of like, the public policy sphere, and just kind of looking at, I guess, political, economic, social policy on a whole, we've seen people, across the world kind of propose all sort of different things to help us kind of better protect the natural world. In America, we have people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proposing things like, the Green New Deal. And, we've had obviously policies, from people in terms of emission reduction targets. We have the Paris Agreement, We have people, arguing for different dates, like, 2030, 2050, to reach net zero emissions. And we've kind of got all sorts of competing kind of ways. Some people, advocate for nuclear power. Some people think, we should invest in geothermal or hydropower. And there's kind of all different solutions. Is there kind of one particular one that is kind of close to your heart, or that you think it would be a vital asset? And it doesn't even have to be one that, even is that popular in the public sphere, but is there one that you think there should be more discussion around in terms of helping us kind of better protect the natural world?
Yeah, we need more trees. There's one proven technology to take carbon out of the atmosphere, and that's trees. And we have cleared land in Australia at an absolutely staggering rate. And land continues to be cleared here in New South Wales at an absolutely staggering rate. And it's the simplest thing that we could do. It's inexpensive. It would help not just climate, but it would help water. It would help temperature. It would help agriculture. There's all sorts of things that get better if we get better at managing our forests and start to reforest. So start expanding the forest estate. If we can do better at trees, we can do better across the board. We can do, it helps with species, it helps with everything. I think you're right. There are a lot of solutions, and some of those solutions compete with each other, and some of them don't. Some of them are just completely complementary. The single biggest challenge is how do we, in the first instance, slow down how much carbon we're putting into the atmosphere. Hopefully we'll get over that very quickly. How do we stop putting a net amount of carbon into the atmosphere? And hopefully that will happen before 2050. I think 2050 is too late now. And we need to start thinking about how we would get there sooner. And I actually think it's within our capacity to get there sooner. New South Wales right now has a carbon reduction target of 35% by 2030. We're going to blitz that target. Even if we had no new policies, the policy settings that we've got will absolutely blitz that target. So we should be thinking about more ambition. I think we should be talking about a 65 or 70% emissions reduction target by 2030. And we should be talking seriously about what would it take to get to net zero by 2035 or 2040. Those things are within our capacity if we have a sort of sensible, sober conversation about it. And we can do it in a way that actually expands rather than contracts our economy. So getting carbon out of the atmosphere, first and foremost, is the task. The dual task is to make sure that people are looked after in the process. The people who are on the front line of climate change are being looked after, whether that's our brothers and sisters in the Pacific, whether it's farmers and people who live in regional Australia, whether it's people who live in Western Sydney and are looking down the barrel at the urban heat island effect, where we'll have temperatures that are unlivable within Sydney. There are a lot of people who stand to lose a lot and to bear the brunt of climate change. We've got to make sure we look after those people in the process. And of course, as always, we need to make sure that there is economic prosperity and that we can maintain standards of living. So we've got a few challenges, but they're all very achievable. We can deal with this challenge. We've dealt with things before, and we can deal with this now.
We have one last question, and
do you want me to sing a Taylor Swift song? Is that
that's the final? That's like the kind of question.
So, looking forward 50 years from now, how do you think younger generations will view, Generation Z once they've, had the chance to make, our mark around the world, right? And do you have good feelings about the impact that this generation of leaders will have on our world?
Well, I think there is something cyclical that says that your generation will be resented like the rest of us at various times get resented. So that's coming down whether you like it or not. I think that's just the normal kind of cycle of time. But I think that there is a change in this current generation that is incredibly positive. And I hope you manage to hang on to that. And I hope you manage to build on it. I hope that hubris doesn't end up being the thing that kind of gets the better of you and you think that you, in fact, do have all the answers and have, in fact, got the great virtues because, of course, none of us ever stop learning and we should never stop listening. But I do feel really optimistic that that you guys are going to change the world and it's going to be in the interests of all of us. And I hope that in 50 years' time, people look back on us all right now and say that was a generation of Australians, a generation of citizens around the world who faced a problem, dealt with the problem, faced up to the problem, found solutions, and now we all owe them a debt of gratitude because they have made our lives better. I think that is possible, and I think that that is what is going to happen.
And to kind of end it off, is there one sentence that you would say to young leaders and future leaders that they can kind of hold as, like a kind of guiding, ethos in the future? Is there one thing that you're kind of burning to say to kind of guide people?
I wouldn't presume to want to guide people, but I would say every single day that you wake up, you get to decide what you want your life to be about. And there's a really, really clear choice. You can make it about things that make the world better and push the world forward, or you can make it about things that tear the world apart. And that's every single morning your choice. From tomorrow morning, that's your choice. It was true yesterday as well, by the way. And so whether you're 17 or 77, every single day we all get to decide what we want to make our lives about. And I hope you decide to make the world better.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for being with us. And I think I really enjoyed listening to your responses, and I think they were just really well thought out. And I think there were kind of a few things there that you brought up that, even I coming into this didn't, even think we'd, touch on, especially I think the one, I don't know, for me, the bit that I found most interesting was your kind of idea of just listen. And, especially if you want to be a future leader, not, always trying to take charge, but sometimes you just need to sit back and, kind of let other people kind of, have their piece and kind of tell their story. And I think that's something that I think I'll be taking away from this and kind of making sure that I listen to people more. Yeah.
Wonderful. There's a fantastic TED Talk, Daniel, that is called something like, if you want to help the developing world, shut up and listen.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great. It's really funny and makes exactly the I think the right sort of poignant point. So look it up. It's a real good one. But thanks, guys. That was real fun.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being okay with the surprise Taylor Swift, the ambush question there.
Look, there's a reason I put it in my Twitter bio, right? Like I stand by it.
It's still there. Yeah, it's still there. But I think that was the people's choice.
Very good. Very good.
Well, thank you so much, Chris.
No worries. See you later, guys.
See ya.
Thank you, Chris. See you.